I'm burnt out, statistically and anecdotally, so are you. Let's find out why. 66% of Americans are burnt out at work this year. In Britain, around 600,000 people reported work-related mental health issues and 91% have experienced high levels of stress in the past year. In China, it's reported that over 500,000 people actually die from overwork each year. They even have a word for it, guolaosi. The slogan, often perpetuated by Chinese big tech companies, is 996, 9am to 9pm, 6 days a week. Philosopher Pascal Chabot has put it simply: burnout gives expression to the anxieties of our age. What did it feel like?
Overwhelming.
Stressful, tired, worn out, knackered.
Mentally draining, mentally exhausted.
I've been moved to hear from many of you from around the world. We'll hear many of your stories, we'll talk to some experts, we'll do our history and philosophy, and we'll ask, if we're burnt out, what can we do about it? The term burnout was coined in 1974 in New York. Psychiatrist Herbert Freudenberger was working in a free drug addiction clinic. Something struck him. It wasn't just the addicts that had a problem, it was the staff too. Freudenberger worked from 8am to 9pm at a hospital, then went to the clinic and worked until 11pm and often later, sometimes getting home around 2am. He did this for months on end. People said to him he needed to slow down. His response was, "You think I should be doing less? I should be doing more. There are thousands of these kids and they have no place to turn." In many ways, burnout actually has the same kind of structure as a drug addiction. An idealistic goal, a do-anything attitude to achieving that goal, even if it's a detriment to the self more broadly. Freudenberger noticed, for example, that his fellow clinic staff were actually often in a worse state than some of the patients. Freudenberger wrote Staff Burnout in 1974, and in it he wrote, "As a practicing psychoanalyst, I've come to realise that people, as well as buildings, sometimes burn out. Under the strain of living in our complex world, their inner resources are consumed as if by fire, leaving a great emptiness inside, although their outer shells may be more or less unchanged." What did it feel like?
Distressed, overtired. You start feeling like simple decisions harder to make and get to a resolution. Things you'd normally deal with day to day that are easy become really hard, and you almost get a paralysis about making decisions on stuff.
I'm a medical doctor, just for context, and in the specialty that I am at, that means really long hours and occasionally life and death scenarios. I've experienced burnout like once a year, if I really think about it. I feel it as like an exhaustion that just doesn't go away. It doesn't matter what you do in your free time. It means you start making mistakes. They could potentially endanger people, and that's really hard to deal with. The problem is then you get anxious, or you get frustrated as well, and then you can't sleep as well, and then you get more exhausted, and it's just like, and then you make more mistakes. And it's just like snowballs into this really, really deep, bad place that is really hard to get out of.
We all have an intuitive sense of what burnout is, but let's ask ourselves, what causes the fire to burn in the first place? What happens to us all, individually and societally, when we get psychologically burnt down? What can we learn from all of this? First, there's obviously emotional and physical exhaustion, a sense of overwhelm, of not enough resources or time to do something properly, but there's also an accompanying set of negative attitudes: cynicism, insecurity, depersonalization, meaning a detachment, a retreating back, a reduction in sincerity or meaning in one's work, a kind of numbness, seeing others as just objects, becoming mechanical. Those are some of the symptoms, and I sat down with Mark Rowland, the CEO of Mental Health Foundation UK, to ask more about those causes and what happens with burnout in general. His answers were fascinating. Hi Mark, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be here, Lewis.
In your role and from the position of Mental Health Foundation more broadly, what do you see as the the root causes of burnout? Is it as simple as overwork, or is there some more nuance in who experiences it? Where do you see it the most? Where is it most a problem?
There are the external drivers of burnout, which I alluded to earlier on, which come around your job design, the demands of that job, the autonomy and the fairness. And broadly speaking, if you're in a job where you're treated unfairly, you have no control over that job, and there are excessive demands being placed on you in terms of your time and resource, almost anyone is going to find that hugely stressful, and that's going to lead to burnout. So I think there are some things that are baked into the human condition which make being treated unfairly, not being able to deliver against unreasonable expectations, and having low levels of control, that shouldn't be considered an illness in terms of responding to that, or some sort of weakness. Human beings are designed psychologically for community and protection and belonging. And when that is systematically undermined, you will find a big psychological toll. So the first set of external drivers is fairly consistent. We're all in that boat, and actually this is where it comes to resilience is quite interesting, because with burnout, sometimes the most resilient, the people who believe that they can cope with that, end up creating a bigger problem downstream than the people who are saying, this is not reasonable, I need to get help or get out. So there is a fairly universal reaction to those external drivers.
Okay, so we can add excessive demands, lack of control, a need for autonomy and fairness to our list of causes. It often, but not exclusively, happens in people-facing work. Nurses, psychiatrists, doctors, teachers, social workers, and I heard from many of you. In the US, burnout is highest amongst teachers, and burnout is generally higher in the US than in Europe.
I'm a high school teacher. I have just finished my training, and this is my first year of teaching, and I didn't realise quite how much the pressure was going to be with the marking and the dealing with the kids and dealing with parents more than anything else. It's just caused me to reach a level of I am running on fumes, and any sleep that I get isn't as effective as it was before, and the fact that I have ADHD really doesn't help, and I am so looking forward to the 6 weeks off that we're getting soon.
But there's an interesting tension we'll explore between overwork and the structure of work, the autonomy and the control and other things that Mark pointed to. Compare Freudenberg's overwork to British MP John Lubbock, for example. Lubbock was the British MP behind the Bank Holiday Act of 1871. Because of Lubbock, us Brits will enjoy 8 national holidays this year. Lubbock was so popular he became known as Saint Lubbock among the working class. He wrote, "Work is a necessity of existence, but rest is not idleness. Because to lie sometimes under the grass, under trees on a summer's day, listening to the murmur of water, or watching the clouds float across the sky, is by no means a waste of time." But while he praised the virtues of idleness, Lubbock was no slouch. He was a Member of Parliament, played county cricket, played in the 1875 football FA Cup final, ran a bank, was the president of the Institute of Bankers, was chairman of the London County Council, was councillor to the Queen, was president of the Royal Statistical Society and the Anthropological Institute, was vice of the Royal Society, and wrote several books, including a 2-volume Pleasures of Life on the Importance of Rest. I wanted to start with Lubbock to make the point that work can be very meaningful, and it's often about the structure of work rather than the quantity of work. I love my work, as billions of other people do. So I think to understand burnout, it's not just to think about working less and overwork and having more time off, although that often is the case, but it's also about how to make work, and by extension life, more meaningful, to get more out of ourselves, not more productivity, but more life. This is why understanding burnout is so crucial right now. It connects the personal to the political, the medical to the philosophical, plus it has a history, a then and a now, and it's serious. It can be both a warning sign and it can kill.
Yeah, I think its basic impact can be extremely serious in terms of degrading someone's ability to be resilient and be able to cope with life. And it's a gateway to then experiences of depression, anxiety, even the experiences of psychosis and other serious forms of mental illness that can have long and enduring impacts. So, it's a bit like asking how serious is being burnt by fire. And, you can be burnt by fire by scolding yourself. You withdraw, you recover quite quickly. But you can also have lifelong scarring impacts if you're seriously at third-degree burns, where you're not able to escape from that kind of exposure. And so the psychological risk and the psychological impact really depends. It shouldn't be underestimated.
Lubbock believed that rest was both good for the soul and for productivity, that idleness can be the wellspring of creativity. This was towards the end of the first industrial revolution, and workers had gone from dreadful, unsafe conditions and long hours to fighting for and winning the 8-hour working day and safety regulations. As we talk about a lot on Then and Now, history isn't linear, it's complex. What seems like progress in one area can lead to regression in another. Anthropologists have found that hunter-gatherers, in general, were well nourished and only worked around 15 hours a week. So much so that the anthropologist Michael Salins called his study of hunter-gatherers like the Kung of the Kalahari the original affluent society. Some have pointed to pre-industrial artisan workers as having better lives prior to the Industrial Revolution. In 1833, for example, Manchester surgeon Peter Gaskell wrote a book criticising the factory system, saying that before it he remembered the average person commonly lived to a good round age, worked when necessity demanded, ceased his labour when his wants were supplied according to his character, and if disposed to, spent time or money in drinking. But we shouldn't romanticize the past. There were trade-offs, of course, big ones. What happened when famine struck, when disaster hit, when conflict or injury or illness broke out amongst the individual, the family, the tribe, the group? Historians have also shown how people were grateful for the steady work in factories. Farming was temperamental and very back-breaking work too. Many reported it being worse. There's no simple story, but people certainly seem to have used to work less. As historian Joyce Appleby points to in her History of Capitalism, the number of public feast days declined as capitalism spread across the 17th to 19th centuries. Saint Monday was often comically pointed to as the saint of the Monday hangover. Monday was often referred to as Holy Monday. Weddings, fairs, fetes, feasts, big celebrations and days off were much more common, and hours, of course, were much more laxed, not punched in. Over the 18th century, the average number of days worked increased from 250 to 300 per year. Why? Productivity. Where I live, here in the Midlands of the UK, was ground zero for the productivity movement. 18th century potter Josiah Wedgwood experimented with different clay oven temperatures and casts and worker routines and bells and clocks and records and canal systems, all to get costs down and productivity up. Wedgwood started a tradition of industrial productivity that led all the way to Frederick Taylor's scientific management theories at the end of the 19th century. Taylor was the father of the efficiency movement, a scientific approach to work. He'd stand with a stopwatch, which he carried around with him everywhere, measuring every movement of the worker, shaving off seconds here and there, breaking up each movement into its parts and comparing them with each other, breaking each action and process down into as small a unit as possible and redesigning them all from the bottom up so as to contribute to the most efficient factory system. Generally, as people like Marx commented on, early 19th century industrialists wanted longer, often inhumane hours without having to waste the time or the resources or the admin switching between different workers. In other words, if working the same amount of hours, just employing one worker to do all those hours is better than working two to split them. All of this led to the growth of unions and strikes and the fight for the 8-hour working day. By 1870, hours worked had declined from around 80 per week to around 60, and weekends were becoming more common. People like Lubbock fought for national holidays. Okay, so far so expected. It's a classic tale of capitalism, right? But here's the rub. Often, when given the choice, people historically would choose to work more too, up to a point, that is. Hard work can also be a cage of our own making. When the Great Depression hit in the 1930s, one well-intentioned philanthropic cornflake connoisseur, Will Kellogg, believed it would be better to reduce everyone's hours slightly rather than sack one set of workers. He instituted the 30-hour work week, a 6-hour day, and to everyone's surprise, it worked out great. Injuries were actually less common and productivity even increased. It was so successful that they kept it. In fact, it was great. I'm so sorry. But what happened next was even more surprising. It wasn't Kellogg's who changed his mind and asked the workers to return to their normal hours, but the workers themselves. In his book, Work, A History of How We Spend Our Time, anthropologist James Sussman writes, most workers were clear. They wanted to work longer hours to take home more money, to purchase more or better versions of the endless procession of constantly upgraded consumer products coming onto the market during America's affluent post-war era. And by 1957, most workers had voted to move back to the 40-hour work week. This points to something fascinating we'll return to, that in a world of productivity, we can internalise the demand to do more as a positive, as a cultural positive. But it's not as simple as giving up and saying, well, the workers voted for it like turkeys voting for Christmas. There are wider cultural reasons that are interesting too. Economist Robert Waples looked at the Kellogg's example and saw the managers convincing workers of the importance of their work. Over the period, culturally, shorter hours were denigrated and were seen as feminine, as it was the departments that were mostly women that voted for shorter hours first. Hard work was sold, packaged as part of the American dream. Waples writes, but most importantly, many workers, especially male employees, seem to have changed their tastes. They became embarrassed by the short hours that they were working, shorter than the shifts worked by men at other local jobs. They changed their rhetoric, downplaying the freedom that leisure gave them, and asserting that they were unable to afford a 6-hour shift, that longer hours were needed to keep the wolf from the door, feed the family, and put bread on the table. Waples talks about something we're very familiar with today, productivity coded with masculine metaphors, a cultural phenomenon being about more than just the necessity and the economics of work. What the history of productivity and work shows us is that it's not just about economics and money, it's about culture, politics, and how economics and wider social ideas intersect and interact in our minds. And by the 70s, a new wave of neoliberals were realising that to change the economy, you had to change that culture.
Sorry for the noise that you might hear. I am a seaman currently on a ship, and we're drifting between Korea and Japan, waiting to discharge cargo. I am a high-ranking officer on board, a chief mate, and I'm responsible for the cargo and for a huge list of other duties which should not be covered by a single man. I've been sailing for the last 10 years. This job has gotten harder and harder as these private companies have become more and more tied to this failing capitalist system, and they started cutting costs at every turn to satisfy their shareholders. So now the food is bad. The food was always bad, but now it's terrible. The linen is terrible. The supplies are terrible. The living conditions are actually unacceptable. So yeah, I go home after 5 months on board. I've spent 4 months recuperating, but after a while it stops being enough.
In the 70s, high inflation, unemployment, oil shocks, lower levels of profit and innovation, and public debt challenged the post-war consensus. That consensus was built upon something important that I want you to bear in mind for later: predictability. Job security, factory work, some gradual but consistent wage increases, predictable Fordist factory lines that kind of fit together like a puzzle. Neoliberals believed this structure was stifling productivity and innovation. They wanted a more flexible society. Economist David Weil calls it the fissured workplace. The shift was towards identifying a company's core competencies and outsourcing the rest to contractors. From supply chains to cleaners to marketing to pensions to training, the economy became fractured in pursuit of flexibility, to become light-footed. In the 80s and 90s, entire departments disappeared overnight. In 1993, Apple published an article called The Changed Nature of Workers and Work. It said that more and more companies are laying off permanent staff and relying on contract workers and outsourcing to carry out their business. The emerging workplace has a head and no body. It centralises free-floating talent resources as necessary to meet current needs and changes size from moment to moment as the marketplace dictates. We became untethered, and today subcontractors make up between 40 to 50% of the workplace in tech. Apple, for example, only directly employs around 60,000 people out of the 750,000 who work on its products. And incredibly, one study found that almost all new jobs added to the US economy between 2005 and 2015 were this kind of contingent work. So we've got some key words buzzing around: flexible society, contingent work, fissured workplace. In 1972, a philosopher and a psychoanalyst, Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, were predicting that this new information society that we were moving into, where everything was in flux, where there was a demand to constantly encode and recode information, was leading to what they called a modern man's sickness, a new schizophrenia, that all of this flexibility was going to have consequences. And there's this kind of shift, I feel, towards an acknowledgement that you can't avoid the political if you're going to talk about the causes of these things. You can't avoid the economic, you can't avoid the cultural. What do you make of that? Do you think you have to you have to engage with that?
Listen, that's why mental health is so fascinating for me personally, because it is profoundly personal and deeply political. The big drivers of mental ill health, and this is one of the big reframings. Like, if you experience mental ill health, if you experience burnout, one of the big messages is not just on you. You know, it was originally framed, like mental ill health was originally framed through the medical model, like it's a malfunction of your brain. Your brain's not working, you have a serotonin deficiency. All of that has been largely debunked. There isn't really, there are some genetic drivers, but actually we like to ask not what is wrong with you, but what has happened to you. That's a much more helpful framing. And what has happened to you is a direct result of how we've structured society and the risks that we're putting in place to that people are routinely facing. And so if you've got a context of high inequality, we've seen the psychological impact. If you prioritized an economic system which disproportionately rewards some and penalizes others, that comes with a psychological consequence that we're reckoning with.
Slaves worked all the hours they were awake. I think, like, if they can do it, so can I.
If money is evil, then that building is hell.
How can you not have motivation to get rich when somebody like me with a head start like mine is still working 18-hour days every single day, 7 days a week without a day off? I'm gonna crush you. You don't stand a chance.
Really? Somebody living on
I celebrate capitalism.
$1 a day in Africa is getting up in the morning and saying, I'm gonna be Bill Gates.
That's the motivation everybody needs.
And what do you think caused it?
Being slightly understaffed, I'd say.
Right.
Yeah.
Too much to do, too few resources. Does that
I'd
make
say
sense?
so, yeah. I'd say
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, so I got given a new role, but I also had my existing role to do, so not knowing what to do in my new role, and yeah,
Right.
too much to do.
Towards the end of the day, where you would usually have that definite cut-off period,
Right.
that sort of slid away and you found yourself sort of working 6, 7, 8 at night.
Yeah, know the feeling. In 1983, Time magazine had this cover. In 2020, it had this one. This change, I think, is meaningful because stress, in particular, has an object, a stressor, a boss, a deadline, a difficult client, a problem. We all face stressors, some good and some bad, on a daily basis. Anxiety is a much more free-floating fear. It often has no object, or at least the object is more diffuse. It seems to me that the Fordist economy, while having many stressors, was much more predictable. The neoliberal economy, I know a word so overused now to invite apathy, but let's be clear, the economy is still neoliberal. The neoliberal economy is much less predictable. Those causes we talked about, lack of control, lack of autonomy, lack of fairness, are sacrificed at the altar of competition and productivity. Contractors, gig economy workers, friends and even family can often be jettisoned at the drop of a hat. It's nothing personal, of course, it's just that there's so much choice. Always the better option, always the easier option, always the other option, always the more profitable option. We're in a race to keep up. Let's call it the flexible society. And in a flexible society, meritocracy has been both supercharged and distorted. On the one hand, the best, supposedly, get the gig. You can be supremely successful in a global economy if you're talented, privileged, or in the right place at the right time. But the flexible society supercharges downward mobility too. In fact, whereas for decades, maybe even a century, upward mobility was not just the norm but expected, that you would do better than your parents, today downward mobility is increasing at a pace faster than upward mobility. In the US, research shows that a child born in the 1940s had a 90% chance of earning more than their parents. For children born in the 1980s, this figure dropped to about 50%. Since the 80s, we've seen a great decoupling of GDP growth from real median earnings. GDP continues to rise, but the gains go to the top. Over the past 40 years, to take one statistic that we're so familiar with, CEOs have had an almost 1,000% pay increase, while average workers have had just a 10% increase. Again, you now have roughly the same chance as doing poorer than your parents than you are as doing better than them. Upward or downward mobility? Flip a coin. On top of this, extreme inequality puts pressure on almost every resource except mass-producible consumables, on housing, on education, on healthcare, on politics. The richest can outbid the poorer on any commodity that's slow to build or extract or produce, pushing up prices of assets. They can avoid taxes around the world, can buy up media and political access. Keeping up with the Joneses, in short, is pretty impossible when the Joneses are flying on a SpaceX rocket. This is not just a video about inequality, although that is the unignorable star of almost every story right now. But it's also about lack of time, lack of control, resources, autonomy and fairness, and we have to separate these things out to understand them properly. But what's philosophically interesting to me is the unignorable link between a flexible society and an insecure society. If society is flexible, you can be let go of, you can be jettisoned, you can be ignored, you can make it or break it, you can be going up or you can be going down at any moment. Technology, the internet, globalization, consumerism, tourism, ease of travel, cultural changes all mean we are culturally, socially, professionally and personally flexible, as well as economically flexible. We are postmodern, untethered, presented with numerous opportunities, places to go, jobs to take, hobbies to pick up, people to see. There's so much to do, so many choices, so many demands. If burnout is in some sense the fear of insecurity that comes with the flexible society, because remember, if you can be flexible with people, then people can be flexible with you, then this applies to longevity of relationships, to divorce rates, to moving away from family to get a job in the city, to not looking after elders, to not committing to one hobby or profession, because there's always another choice. There's always more to do. When there's so many things to do, so many possible options, we're judged on how many of them we've done, how many we've achieved. Have you slouched on the couch or travelled the world? The demand of meritocracy, in an unequal world especially, is that you're expected to do more and more with less and less, to make it from nothing. That is the marker of productive iron excellence, right? As Anne Helen Peterson describes in her book Can't Even, millennials were the first generation to experience this kind of pressure to do as much as possible. They had all sorts of calendar entries for extracurricular hobbies and games and practices and tryouts, leagues, lessons, dance, music, homework, summer camp, theatre school, swimming, and endless exercise in producing a longer, fuller, more enriched CV. In the book The Overachievers, Alexandra Robbins writes that when teenagers inevitably look at themselves through the prism of our overachiever culture, they often come to the conclusion that no matter how much they achieve, it will never be enough. It's all about getting that good university spot, that great placement, to prove your worth in the meritocratic, flexible society. Peterson points to something that resonates with me too. A generation of parenting that was pretty hands-off, almost entirely unsupervised for long periods of time, with both parents out working for the first time in history, and for good reasons. But that means a lot of time spent alone, a lot of time maybe generating anxieties and insecurities. She points to sociological reports, for example, in which children describe endless hours of trying to entertain myself. This, I think, is a strange combination. Half the time entirely alone, insecure maybe, disconnected, potentially anxious, and the other half full of demands, the demand to do, to achieve, to prove as much as possible. The great Enlightenment philosopher Georg Hegel realised that recognition was a central, if not the central feature of how we understand ourselves and think about ourselves self-consciously as social creatures in relation to and recognised by those around us. We recognise and are recognised by others, and how that happens, the way in which that is structured, has consequences for who we are, how we think, and what we do. We are watched, judged, rejected or accepted, we're admonished, and to paraphrase the anarchist thinker Pierre Proudhon, we're inspected, we're spied upon, directed, law-driven, numbered, regulated, enrolled, indoctrinated, preached at, controlled, checked, estimated, valued, censored, commanded by creatures who have neither the right nor the wisdom nor the virtue to do so. In a flexible society, the anxieties of recognition become hyper-focused. When we can be dropped at any moment, when we can move anywhere, go where we want, hypothetically, flick through dating apps indefinitely, follow and unfollow anyone at will, contract and hire and rehire and freelance when we want, review and be reviewed at all times, how much we achieve, what our CV shows, what our record shows, plus a decline in traditional cohesive communities, families, a lack of linear security, a lack of enough resources to do the job, effectively contributes to the race to achieve more and more and not to stop to both be insecure, anxious, and always on. Jean-Paul Sartre agreed with Hegel on the importance of recognition when he said famously that hell is other people. He was talking about the effect of eternal judgment, the what are you worth, the type of judgment that has been accelerated by another feature of human life, technology. Okay, a quick then and now recap on the importance of historicising. How we talk about these things has changed over time, and that matters. Our language, our culture, our history can have a direct effect on our health. As the historian Roger Cooton reminds us in this book, even the body has a history. And as Mark told me, mental health contributes to 23% of the overall disease burden. Should we then be stoic? Should we be Buddhist? Should we be cognitive psychiatrists? All of these are historical. They're given to us historically. And our culture is like a reservoir we draw from. So it's crucial that reservoir is well filled. Stress, for example, is a relatively new medical concept, first studied as a medical concept in the 1930s. Stress before was an industrial metaphor, the stress placed on metal, for example. And before stress, the American psychiatrist Charles Beard coined neurasthenia. What he saw as a modern illness affecting Americans nervous and anxious about modern life. Interestingly, he blamed steam engines, the media, the telegraph, the speed of materialism for putting too much pressure on people. He wrote, "The perfection of clocks and the invention of watches have something to do with modern nervousness, since they compel us to be on time and excite the habit of looking to see the exact moment so as not to be late for trains or appointments. Before the general use of these instruments of precision in time, there was a wider margin for all appointments. We are under constant strain, mostly unconscious, oftentimes in sleeping as well as in waking hours, to get somewhere or to do something at some definite moment." A quote that's a great reminder of how mental health, how we think about it, is historical. It's determined by what's around us. Before neurasthenia, there were the four humours that might have been disbalanced, dysregulated in the body. There was melancholy and hysteria. There were religious maladies and ancient ones too. There were culture-bound syndromes that only exist in certain cultures. My point is this: mental health is structural and historical. It does not just come from us, but happens to us too. It's dependent on all sorts of historical, social, political, economic and cultural factors, all in a relationship with each of us individually. What do you guys think the causes were when it happened?
Lack of awareness on how to censor myself around technology.
So you think it's a technological problem?
I do. I think it's massively predicated in social media. So we've got this thing that can do everything, that's super addictive, but it comes with no instruction manual on how to use it.
So
when
true.
To turn it off, when to use it, when to engage like this with no technology, or go for a walk, or get into nature. So yeah, I think that's the predicator is that, yeah.
Here's a brief list of apps that I use every day. Google Docs, Sheets, Drive, OneDrive, Microsoft Word, Excel, Adobe Premiere, Photoshop, Slack, YouTube Analytics, around 4 email accounts for some reason, WhatsApp, Garmin Connect, X, Facebook, Instagram, 2 accounts, Reddit, many different news apps. You get the point. Add in your favourite wider modern phenomena, plus train timetables, childcare hours, different schedules and calendars and alerts and notifications and Duolingo reminders and meal planning notification and bank apps and Fitbits, all of which have managed to circumvent personal boundaries by alerting you in your pocket. We are continually plugged into the world. We are continually available, contactable. Do you think technology has something to do with this as well then, because you're always connected, can always be working, it's always there?
Yeah, I mean, not long before that, started using Microsoft Teams, which became invaluable. You know, it was like, that's become the sort of de facto way of communicating. Still is for us, to be honest with you. So you were kind of always on, almost, and definitely if you saw something ping at 7 o'clock at night, you were more inclined to.
We're surrounded by demands, the extra stuff we have to do at work, and that was once in many ways more siloed off, someone else's responsibility. Now we can all potentially do everything. I mean, I get burnout keeping up with cameras and lighting and audio and algorithms and demonetization and thumbnails, and I'm very fortunate. Some of the messages you sent sound almost unbearable to me. I would crumble. I put this to Mark.
Burnout is the manifestation of repeated stress. I mean, I see burnout as being the gap between the demands that are consistently placed on you and your time and resources to be able to meet those demands.
I don't want to get all Prometheus and Frankenstein on you, although of course there are classic literary lessons here, but what's happened when we've become slaves to technology? In the 1930s, the economist John Maynard Keynes famously predicted a 15-hour work week by 2030. Now, we're around 5 years off, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's not looking good. Big tech corporations that dominate international economies and have an effect on every other company and corporation and all of our lives actually employ very few people, historically speaking, while being in control of some of the dominant flows of economic revenue. Take Uber, just one example. It's worth around $200 billion, but employs just 31,000 people, and many of those are high earners. That sounds like a lot, but around 8 million people drive for Uber, and of course don't have the relationship with Uber that they would have had with a traditional company. There's been a lot of discussion, for example, about burnout amongst gig economy and Uber workers, anxious about the algorithm, about always being signed on, about customer reviews, about surge pricing. There's always a pressure to log on and do more to make ends meet. This 2022 British Medical Journal study concluded that gig workers reported mental health and life satisfaction worse than those employed full-time and part-time, but better than the unemployed. Mediation analyses show that this was explained by their higher levels of loneliness and financial precarity. And Uber drivers in the UK recently told this BBC reporter that Uber increases commission and drivers cannot see what the passengers actually paid. It's unpredictable. Uber used to take 20% and then up to 41%, often arbitrarily, while drivers have struggled to make ends meet. Many say that the promises are not the reality. And this is the thing with burnout. Every turn we take, we kind of risk going down into a huge other topic that's related and important, but I can only hint to here. All of these deserve wider analyses because Uber is just one example of tech inequities exacerbating inequality and burnout. We hear often that tech in particular has this kind of hustle culture built into it that trickles down the ladder. I talked to tech workers union member Simona about this.
There's a level of tolerance and pushing that is embedded in the culture from the 60s, like the Californian hustle kind of attitude was where the culture of tech was born. And even if you go to Italy, there are still these elements of like hustling culture that are completely alien to other sectors, for example. So
Uber is only the most obvious example. Microsoft managers can access employee chats, emails, calendars, measure productivity. Companies like Amazon are known for tracking toilet time and outsourcing as much to cheap foreign markets as possible. The point here is that burnout is a technological phenomenon as much as a medical one, and so any solution has to reckon with how we're connected to each other, in which ways we are recognised through the electronic tools that we use. The Uberification of society risks taking over everything. It is the model of productivity and efficiency over humanism. Everything becomes a hustle, a grind, from driving to just being artists. On Twitter, the artist Adam Jarts wrote, "Do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. Work super fucking hard all the time with no separation and no boundaries, and also take everything extremely personally." Resonates with me. The owl of Minerva flies at dusk, when the candle is almost burnt out. Do we have to go through burnout to get to the other side? Did you do anything specific to get over it?
I think it's just a case of managing my emotions. I'm probably somebody who gets really involved in my own work.
Yeah.
So it's probably just a case of I need to be learn to become more in control of that.
You may have noticed a conspicuous lack of the C word, capitalism. This isn't because burnout isn't a symptom of capitalism. It may be the symptom of neoliberalism, in the same way stress might have been the symptom of Fordist capitalism. Instead, I avoid it because it's implicit in almost everything we do. It is the water we swim in, and in saying it's capitalism, we risk it becoming thought-terminating, both in ourselves and in people it might put off, as if saying capitalism is just the answer to anything. Instead, I want to think about what burnout reveals about capitalism and how it can help us formulate responses to its pathologies. What I mean is, it's easy to say a lack of resources and intense competition causes burnout, but what could be more revealing is asking what being burnt out can tell us about a world that's burning us. Because as we've seen, burnout is about more than just simple working hours. It's about a relationship between many things: work and capitalism, time and technology, a dark side of meritocratic culture. It's about psychology and sociology too.
So I think a lot of people think about burnout as a whole, and it's one of those phrases that's often just overused. The year before last, I had my own experience of severe burnout that did lead to my own little breakdown. And I think that was just due to being so overworked. And when you're in training as well, it's kind of the exhaustion is there from day one. So when you add on all of your training, your placements, the fact that it's unpaid while still trying to manage a job role, and in my case I was doing a psychology degree on top, it was a lot. But you don't really, it's not just like you can pull a sick day if things are getting too much. You're always thinking about how your actions will impact the clients you work with. So even if you're feeling awful, you likely still go ahead with your sessions. It's very common.
In this book, stress expert Stephen Hobfull has argued that the cognitive focus on mental health has meant we've ignored the socio-historical causes of mental health. He says that I argue that resources are the primary unit of interest in the stress process. But of course this is a resource problem. Of course we all need more time, more breaks, more holidays, vacations, money, staff, energy, capacity, more resources. But saying that doesn't make it so. The more interesting point of analysis is, how does burnout actually help us get more of what's needed? What can we learn about it? Burnout is a radical, potentially revolutionary concept because, unlike, say, anxiety, burnout makes the link between mental and economic spheres clear, between in here and workplaces and the economy and the political unignorably explicit. It's easy to say we need to fix inequality. It's more interesting to ask, how can we use burnout to contribute to that problem? The historian Carl Schlott talked about thinking with history rather than thinking about history. Let's think with burnout. So there are two ends of the analysis that we can approach burnout from as a problem: the individual and the societal. One obvious issue is that the societal model feels so insurmountable, out of our control, structural, beyond us. Chabot puts it like this: society is perceived as a selfish and destructive giant. We ascribe to it a colossal amount of power, dwarfing that of our unconscious desires, and that we are a defenceless child, bereft of resources. But the societal model, of course, ignores the individual. There are individual lives, neuroses, inner conflicts, traumas, psychologies and position in the world, out on the world. The only response is a relational one. How? In what ways are we connected to society? In what ways do we make society and are moulded by it. Let's start with what happens to the individual when they're burning out. Then we can look at what that means for how we approach burnout on a societal level more broadly. The psychologist Gary Chernis points to 3 stages of burnout. The causes, as we've seen, are lack of resources, demands that exceed our need for autonomy and control, fairness and insufficient rewards for our work. And the results, according to Chernis, are Stage 1 is stress, an imbalance between resources and demands. Stage 2 is emotional tension, fatigue and exhaustion. And Stage 3 is changes in our attitudes and behaviour. This is where depersonalisation and cynicism and coping mechanisms, maybe addictions, come in. Philosophically, I find cynicism fascinating. Depersonalisation and cynicism result in a collapse in meaning in our perspectives on life. Psychologist Christina Maslach, a very influential thinker on burnout, writes that people are becoming cynical, keeping their distance, trying not to let themselves get too involved. Cynicism is a loss of idealism. It's important and useful to see how burnout is most common in places that seem most human, most humanly important. Teaching children, caring for the sick, the addict, the maternity ward, places so full of what's called moral injury, where workers are called upon to do things and make difficult choices that strain or go against their moral or ethical beliefs.
As a medical provider, my therapist and I have discovered that much of my burnout comes from moral injury. I don't have a reliable method of helping my patients access resources to address basic needs like safe housing, adequate and nutritious food, or medical care on a regular basis.
Psychiatrist Alexis Berger writes that in a stress-inducing situation, the natural behaviour exhibited by animals is a fight or flight response, but in a care-based relationship, which, by definition, represents a concentration of difficult interactions, one can neither escape nor attack. One is obligated to stay, even if one finds it unbearable. You have to stay, but you mentally check out. Depersonalisation means becoming a robot, sometimes even becoming negative and cynical, not just towards the system, but towards the receiver of your service, or more worryingly, your care. The most influential philosopher of burnout is the South Korean thinker Byung-Chul Han. Han frames burnout as happening in a permissive society where everything is possible, everything is allowed, everything is potentially achievable. The flip side of this world of positivity is that it demands an excess from us. We used to live in a disciplinary society. Many more rules, obligations, duties, prisons, stricter punishment, stricter education, but we now live in what he calls an achievement society. Should is replaced by can. Everything is possible. The major psychological difference is that in a disciplinary society, we're exploited by an other. In an achievement society, we auto-exploit ourselves, often voluntarily. Han writes, excess work and performance escalate into auto-exploitation. This is more efficient than allo-exploitation, that's exploitation from the outside. For the feeling of freedom attends it, the exploiter is simultaneously the exploited. Han talks about our egos bursting open, that we're standing utterly alone. Everything is on us, our successes, our failures, the world. Han's Burnout Society is a short but complicated book, but there's a section I found particularly different and insightful. He says that in an achievement society, we must be self-starting. But, he says, it's impossible to reward oneself. The achievement society appears as meritocratic. Everything is on us as individuals to perform, to do, to be, to choose, to dream. It's the society of freedom and individuation. That sounds great, but what if that's precisely what's wrong? What if, as Hegel said, we are psychologically, maybe even evolutionarily, entirely bound up with notions of recognition from others? What if we cannot avoid recognition? That it's a constituent part of our logical and emotional regulation, but that we've become so free that we only recognise the goals, achievements, ambitions, performance that we set ourselves, that we only recognise ourselves, that we live in a society where we only have ourselves to blame, where we auto-exploit ourselves. We're expected to be achieving, doing, performing, choosing, dreaming, based on our lone desires. We are free, but maybe we don't want to be. As the sociologist Richard Sennett says, self-absorption does not produce gratification, it produces injury to the self, and Han calls it the violence of positivity. He points out that in this kind of society, we actually avoid achieving our goals by always moving on to the next goal. We cannot celebrate, we cannot stop, we cannot be for just a second, because the next achievement, the next thing, the next goal always beckons us forth. A society of the individual self ironically becomes a society of self-sacrifice. At the end of the 19th century, the sociologist Emil Durkheim talked about what he saw as a consequence of the breakdown of moral and social guidance and glue, of social values. He described it as anomie, and he thought it led to, quote, a malady of infinite aspiration that was the result of those who, quote, no longer know what is possible and what is not, what is just and what is unjust, which claims and expectations are legitimate and which are immoderate. This is Han's point. We auto-exploit because we cannot learn these things ourselves, alone. No man is an island. We get them in some way from interaction with and pressures of the wider social group. Sociology becomes psychology. That leads to a kind of worrying question. Is it the flexible society that leads to auto-exploitation? And more worryingly, is it freedom itself that leads to auto-exploitation? Having too much choice, having too many things to do. Do we need to seek the cure, unintuitively maybe, in some kind of unfreedom, in some kind of positive exploitation? And what I mean from that is giving ourselves over to a positive structure that in some way leads us to being not burnt out, that tells us when we can stop, that demands that we stop at certain times, whether that is a positive social life, culture, politics, economics. Freedom itself becomes overbearing. Think about a Sunday. A Sunday is a way in which we have societally determined, almost by compulsion, that we must rest. It's as old as the Bible. That's how long it has to be in place for it to be unignorable. And even then, I find the pressure to do some work on a Sunday quite difficult to resist.
Listen, there's probably some times that, my wife will say I'm guilty of it just now, but certainly not to the level it was, back in those days. And things have pretty much got back to mostly normal, I would say, on that front.
We've prioritised freedom and flexibility over community and security, some kind of normative idea that comes from the community. And I don't mean community and security in a kind of naive, vulgar way. I mean security metaphorically almost, as if anchored to something, where something comes from something expected and routine that you can set your watch by. And we've done all this, we've prioritised that freedom and flexibility for some very, very good reasons. Innovation and freedom and individual choice, that flexible society. But maybe we've tipped the balance a bit too far. What changed?
As you've experienced it once, then noticing the early trigger signs.
Interesting.
So once you've experienced it once and you go, I got myself to a point that I had to take some defined measures. The second time, third time around, when you go, there's some early trigger points here, I can make adjustments sooner.
Be aware of the trigger points.
Yeah.
I like that. Han points out that multitasking is an attitude that doesn't represent civilizational progress. It is in fact a regression because it's so commonplace among wild animals. He says it's an attentive technique indispensable for survival in the wilderness. Or Deleuze and Guattari's claim that we've become schizophrenic. This is a complaint I often hear from my own mouth. It's too much. I open my e-reader thing and have hundreds of books to flick through, different chapters, different paragraphs. I get overwhelmed by the choice. It sounds like from a lot of you have similar issues, that at work you have too many things to juggle. It's almost not about the workload sometimes, but just keeping track of all the things. It's a burden on the mind. Let's contrast the flexible society with linear security. Institutions like guilds, unions, families, clubs, even monarchies or tribes or businesses have some kind of what I'll call linear security baked into them. They're structured to endure linearly through time. Linearity aims to predict. It aims to control and somewhat secure the future for the members of the group so that you know what to expect from each other, from the environment, from the wider norms. You can quite literally set your clock, set your watch to that linearity. You can see the future. Linear security is somewhat formulaic. Going to see family on a Sunday, regulating workplaces, having routines and schedules, having a standard wage, say, a predictable increase over time, going to the same church, reading from the same hymn book. These are all forms of linear security. In many cases, linearity is the death of creativity and innovation and freedom. Guilds controlled and heavily regulated their profession up to the point that you couldn't legally do the thing that you wanted to do without being part of the guild. They controlled it for reasons like controlling prices and wages and making sure people couldn't cheat and circumvent the authority of the people already in the profession. This, of course, will stifle in many ways the other pole, the freedom, the creativity, the innovation. The security model is linear and predictable. It is in many ways safe. The flexible model is unpredictable and chaotic, but it is creative and innovative. Of course, we need a balance between the two. But it's interesting that Han uses the word wilderness, that multitasking reminds him of animals in the wild. Because it's similar to the distinction that Nietzsche drew between what he called the Dionysian and the Apollonian spirit. That is, the kind of wild and the regulated, the disordered kind of bubbling up from underneath, and the imagery and the lines and the words and the reason that we use to describe it, the logic on top. Nietzsche believed in the period he was living in that they needed more of the Dionysian. But he also believed that a healthy culture integrates both. Are we too flexible? This may sound counter to how many of you feel burnout, how you feel it in the body, how you think about it. How are we too flexible when it feels like you have no flexibility, no freedom? You've got too much to do. Not enough choice in your personal life, not enough work-life balance. As we saw, burnout often comes from a lack of autonomy, of having too many demands placed on you. That doesn't seem flexible. But that sense of overwhelm is from having too much to do, which is a sense of too much flexibility, too much multitasking, too many things to juggle. Plus, it's a result of too much flexibility, or the possibility of too much flexibility, up the chain that's exerting pressure on you down the chain. The flexibility of the economy, of politics, of contract, the flexibility of tech, of always on, of having to achieve many different things, of the race to the bottom. They all hover above, pushing down on us. Burnout is often referred to as a mirror disorder. It's society reflected back into us, society reflected onto us, moulding us, shaping us. When I read Nietzsche's descriptions of the Dionysian, and I'm simplifying quite a lot here, but it feels to me very much like the frantic, dysregulated overwhelm that accompanies burnout. Remember, this isn't just a positive, negative thing. Sometimes we need the Dionysian, sometimes it expresses itself in a good way, and sometimes it's too much, it's overbearing, and we use the Apollonian to kind of pen ourselves in, to limit us, to know what we're doing predictably. But the kind of Dionysian energy that accompanies burnout seems very much at odds with the kind of 19th century structure that Nietzsche was writing in, where morals were handed down and acted upon from the priesthood. An interesting finding, for example, is that role ambiguity is moderately to highly correlated in studies with burnout. This happens when there's not enough information to do a job well. Nurses often report it. Lacking supervisor support also has been found to have positive correlation with burnout. Lack of feedback too. And this is the point, it's often not just the work overload, but the structure of work.
Hi Lewis and team, my name is Lily and I was a mental health direct support professional during COVID here in Minneapolis, Minnesota in the United States. The burnout that I experienced in my role was so great. I genuinely feel lucky to have survived. I was working 10 to 12 plus hour shifts, 6-7 days a week almost, because the personnel that left with their uncomfortability in COVID. It was a really scary time. I remember having to wear a hazmat suit, and it got so bad that I developed alopecia. And when I saw the physical representation of my stress so clearly evident as a bald spot on my head, I had to stop. I took a leave of absence and spent some time recovering. And after reflecting on it for a really long time, I realized that I just simply couldn't work in that field anymore. The stress was too great on my body and on my mind. On my mind also because I didn't feel like I was properly caring for people. Our model of mental health care in the United States is not actually conducive to well-being, so couldn't do it anymore. Anyways, thanks.
And again, I'm very aware here that my burnout is nowhere near as bad as many of you, and that my work situation is highly specific and particular. It's not universal. And I have no idea what it's like to work in a Manchester office or an American hospital or education in India, take your pick. But this kind of Dionysian mix does resonate with me. The idea that we are both overly free and overly flexible, and that comes with a kind of role ambiguity and a lack of supervisor support and feedback, that really resonates with YouTube work, because as mentioned, there's a lot of different things to juggle, fine, but there's also the sense that the algorithm is kind of out of your control, and that social media platforms have moved away from the regulated linear subscriber model, where I have some level of confidence that I can publish a video and you will all, for the most part, see it. This has now moved to the flexible model, where the videos served are the best performing, most clickable, most viral videos with the most explosions and the most sensationalist topics, regardless of whether you've subbed or not. I've heard from many YouTubers who are experiencing this. Chuck in AI and we're all pretty anxious. As Patreon founder Jack Conte recently talked about in this video, this is terrible for creators, for stability, for quality over the long term, which is also why it really helps me if you click that bell and join us on Patreon and other socials. You can watch ad-free and early, you can just keep up on Patreon for free, you don't even have to pay, but there are bonus videos, join the community, it's great, I'll leave a link below. It's more of a grind though, for me to get seen by the algorithm over time, because there's less and less linear security in the algorithm. We need mechanisms for linear security. The point of linear security is to regulate the components that are working together in some way, so that each part can work effectively with the whole. It's a little bit like a car. You could say, well, okay, each part can do whatever it wants to perform as well as possible. We want a high performance society. And so one overachieving wheel in the car says, all right, and shoots off. An engine part spins out of control faster and faster. The exhaust overheats and the car bursts apart. That's what burnout's like. There has to be some agreement between components. And in this case, the components are us. The incredibly frustrating thing about burnout is that, like car wheels shooting off and burning out, it seems so obviously inefficient and pointless. No one, most employees included, wants a burnt out workforce. Mark told me that 23% of the disease burden in the UK later on comes from mental health issues earlier. Stress and burnout and adaptive behaviours like drinking and eating and addiction. If that's the case, prevention at the beginning isn't just a wishy-washy ideal of a compassionate society, a humane society. It's entirely consistent with a productive, efficient, high-performing society too. I asked Mark why he thinks we don't focus on this more politically then.
The entire political system, as we know, is a short-term game. You know, you've got a 4-year election cycle. Some of the big societal problems that we have, including mental health, are intergenerational and long-term. And so it's that basic political incentive often undermines. You know, prevention is like the dog that never barks. You know, everyone talks about it, no one's willing to invest in it, and I think, but the potential gains are huge, and you can see that internationally with the countries that have invested it. Even when you do the international comparisons of where we spend money, we spend much more of our public sector money than other countries on treating and responding to the problem than we do on health creation, keeping people in work. Other countries do put more money into that sphere. It's called, you know, health generation is a part of public health. It's called salutogenesis. It's putting in place the environment that people can flourish in. And like you say, it's not a simple science, but there's massive payoffs.
Freudenberger wrote that in every fire, even a burnt out one, there are glowing embers. You can use them to rekindle the spark. The causes of burnout, as we've heard, aren't straightforward. They can be individual, social, company specific, they can be economic, political, they can be psychological, they can be sociological. My own often comes from an anxiety about the future that drives me to work anxiously. For others, the causes are technology always being on. They are political, they might be from economics and inequality. This makes it difficult to generalise about burnout, but the fact that it's become so general necessitates a very general answer. The very generality of it suggests, generally speaking, a broken system, whether that's a social system, a political system, or an economic system. Something is clearly wrong. Take Han's achievement subject. Han writes, the exhausted, depressive achievement subject grinds itself down. It's tired, exhausted by itself, and at war with itself, entirely incapable of stepping outward, of standing outside itself, of relying on the other, on the world. It locks its jaws on itself. Paradoxically, this leads the self to hollow and empty out. It wears out in a rat race it runs against itself. This is such an insightful quote, and it shows how burnout is often much more complex than boss needs more work done, although it can be that too. But as the Kellogg's example showed us, we are often all complicit in some way, in a kind of personal or social or cultural rat race in our own heads. For me, the most interesting general psychological reference point that's come up frequently in all of this is the point of recognition. If Han is right, the ego continues burning itself out because it's impossible for it to self-recognize. We always need some kind of external reference points. Of course, the profit motive under capitalism, the race to the bottom, the need to outperform competitors and squeeze more out of your workers absolutely undermines this. But other things do too. The anxious subject is always seeking some kind of recognition that's unavailable to it, potentially within but still unavailable. Remember, we're not talking about simple, well done recognition. Recognition is non-simple. We embody recognition ourselves. It's part of us, and there are different types of recognition. We can be recognized, we can be seen both negatively and positively. As Hegel knew, recognition is conflict, both good and bad. It's the point where our inner subject meets the subject of the other, the outside inside, the social in our heads that regulates how our individual characters and personalities become socialized. The French sociologist Alain Ehrenberg said, with the gospel of personal development on the one hand and the cult of performance on the other, conflict does not disappear. However, it loses its obvious quality and can no longer be counted on to guide us. If we can't exist by recognizing ourselves, if we cannot be recognized by the system of work we exist in or the technology we use, if we are under-resourced, over-laboured, if we lack autonomy and control, the only thing left to do is to seek that recognition elsewhere, in some other social group, in a union, in a pressure group, in a protest group, in a political party. If burnout leads to cynicism, it could also be that cynicism, a breakdown in social recognition, in idealism, contributes to burnout. Maybe we need to accept that recognition is lacking or hidden or transferred in certain places. That the only place to seek that recognition is in a place which seeks to fix a broken system, workplace or person. Maybe that's the route to overcoming what seems like an insurmountable problem. If cynicism is a lack of meaning, if linear security is its cure, then positive conflict, accepting the conflict, being part of the conflict, might be the route to change. Han writes that the late modern achievement subject is subject to no one. Maybe this is the great irony of freedom under modernity, that it's actually a kind of mirage, that we are never really free, and we always need to seek out, accept, and make plain the recognition and the points of conflict, to lean into the conflict, to let yourself be recognized in the point of conflict as part of social life. That ironically, giving up freedom is the route to feeling more free, that freedom is a burden that makes us anxious in many ways. In other words, make yourself a subject. And I'm being controversial here because I'd rather poke around in esoteric and strange and contradictory ideas that might lead in new directions than point out something simple like we just need more resources and that it's capitalism stupid. The better analysis always uncovers things through this kind of deep analysis, through this overturning, that the idea that we might make ourselves subjects and become slaves to something, to some higher social value, to positive change, might be the route, ironically, to making us feel more free and less burnt out, I think is a fascinating one. We need to remember there are many types of freedom. Freedom has changed over time, how we think about it and how we live it. Neoliberal freedom has been sold to us as the ultimate globalised freedom. Freedom of global choice in work, play, travel, dating, entertainment. But it's freedom of choice, which comes with an unbearable demand to make exactly the right choice against a whole world of competitors. If that type of freedom comes with the moral injury of insurmountable demands in what feels like an always shrinking amount of time, then what sort of freedom is it? There's a section in E.P. Thompson's famous book, The Making of the English Working Class, that's always stayed with me. It's about the idea of a moral economy, one that says, to hell with what the market says a loaf of bread costs, there's always a just price, a right price. Demands are philosophically interesting. The whole world demands things from us, and we from the world. There's nothing wrong with demands. The demands of family life and friendship, the demands of virtue and meaningful work. They're unavoidable and they're good. But if Han is right about auto-exploitation in an achievement society in which we're always running free but scattered in our heads, and that we cannot reward ourselves, maybe we need to give ourselves over to a bigger moral demand, a just demand. These types of moral demands can't be achieved by ourselves alone. They're much bigger, much more important. They take big groups, unions, political parties or movements, even religious organisations, group that have and seek some kind of moral demand at their core. Maybe it's time we ditched individualist freedom and gave ourselves over to the demands of something bigger. We must learn from Kellogg's that we are in a fight together to justify that 4-day week, to make the case for it, to make the case for shorter hours, or maybe Friday afternoons off, to follow the evidence which shows quite conclusively that 4-day weeks are actually more productive, not less. We're in a prisoner's dilemma because we're all scared of being the one that stops first, that checks out, that demands change, that stands out from the crowd. We must become slaves to freedom. We must become slaves to a group fighting for change, to be captive to a group and driven by its demands to recognise the need for a different work structure. It might mean organising, joining a union, a pressure group. It might mean putting the case to your boss with your colleagues. It might mean quitting altogether. It might mean therapy. It might mean radical political change. The point is, we need to get involved. These moral demands of bigger purpose than us alone demand linear security. If we think about linear security, we think about predictability. Laws, regulations, principles, moral codes, many things we've constructed as humans are about linear predictability, linear security, so that we don't fall victim to the vicissitudes of bad luck. Socialised healthcare, pensions, the right to own a home, trial by jury, all of these are designed with this in mind, so that we have something predictable that we can go to when we need it. In 2014, Zeynep Ton wrote a bestseller on the good jobs strategy, arguing, showing, that companies that prioritise good pay, benefits, schedules, employee meaning and dignity often actually outperform the companies that try and cheat these steps and get cheaper labour and pay lower wages. She points to companies where employees report high job satisfaction, companies like Costco and Quick Trip and Trader Joe's in America. And similarly in the UK, many companies that trialled a 4-day week for a study continued the 4-day week after. Ton writes that Quick Trip, for example, offers affordable healthcare, a stable schedule and significant training, and promotes managers exclusively from within with corresponding pay increases. And the results are staggering. Its lines are fast, its customers incredibly loyal, its sales per square foot are 50% higher than the industry average, and employee turnover is just 13% compared to 59% amongst the top quarter of the convenience store industry. Burnout is the realisation of the tortoise and the hare fable. We all think we have to sprint to win the race, and sprinting might mean overwork, it might mean squeezing employees' wages, it might mean putting off that pay increase or that promotion, it might mean not raising the minimum wage out of fear of being outcompeted by your competitor down the road or in China. All the while, the tortoise, a bit more relaxed, a bit more happy, a bit more satisfied, a bit more in control of their vocation, slowly overtakes. We're blind to this. We focus on the immediate instead of the immediate. We want the quick solution, and we're terrified of patience. We need to turn the world upside down to reveal new ways of doing things, to take the mediate and turn it into the immediate. We need to become slaves to another way of doing things. We need to give up being endless, free achievement subjects, avoid cynicism by seeking meaning in resolute change. Mark had a great line. He said, "We too often get sucked into the tyranny of the urgent over the important. The news cycle moves on. We spend money on cancer but not stress prevention. We fear taking a break. We're scared of giving employees an extra hour or an extra day off. We fear the wolf at the door, all the while ignoring that the walls could be crumbling from within." Because a lot of this is structural, I think I get the sense that a lot of people feel helpless, unable to affect any kind of change, fed up with politics, etc. What do you think, if you could, sum up and give one message to quote unquote ordinary people that would help this in some way, what would that be?
I personally think, Lewis, that understanding your own inner life and how you can support good mental health and that journey towards it, I think it's the most exciting and important journey we all go on in terms of our human experience. And I think there's a massive loss if you live your whole life and you haven't engaged with how could I reduce the things that are making me anxious, and how could I find a place of more energy and joy in my life. So I think the number one thing I would say to people is to be courageous, to turn and look at the things that is causing pain. There's a way to understand mental ill health is that your brain is telling you something that is wrong, that needs to change in your life. You may not have all the power and resources to change it, but it's trying to tell you something. It's a warning sign. It's on your side. So listen to that and then decide how you're going to respond. What can you do with compassion to yourself? A couple of weeks ago, my sort of father-in-law, 80 years old now, he went to the doctors for suspected memory loss. And actually, what they found out was that you haven't got memory loss. What you have is underlying anxiety that's very persistent. And here is a man who said, okay, I'm going to go to therapy, age 80, and I'm going to look at those causes of anxiety. And I thought, that's incredibly inspiring at one level, but also a salutary tale for us to say, let's turn and face these things where they're causing a problem. And there's a lot of hope that you can, I know, I've seen it, you can make progress.
All right, everyone, thank you so much, as usual, for watching, and I really appreciate that you've gotten this far. Just watching the video really helps with the algorithm, and a massive thank you, as always, to all these wonderful people on screen now who support Then and Now. As I've already mentioned, it's the only way to keep doing this without sponsorship. These long-form, in-depth videos that take so much time for us to research, put together, edit, all the rest of it. So I am hugely appreciative, and we're trying to make the Patreon membership more and more valuable to you over time by adding courses. There's already a 2-hour course up on thinking differently about history that goes in depth on some of the stuff that undergraduate and postgraduate history students read about the craft of history, about thinking about history. And I think it's put together really well. People seem to enjoy it. You can join and have a look yourself. You can cancel at any time. The course membership level is $2.99, I think, but you can join for $1 and watch ad-free and early, join the discussion and the rest of it, and support videos like this. If not, please do just press subscribe, press that bell, like, comment, share, follow on social media. All that stuff helps so much. Now I'm going to go back to working on the next video. Thank you. See you next time.